Welcome to the website of UNU. This evening in Tokyo, we're going to be speaking with Glen Fukushima, who is a policy expert who has spent many years in Japan, but who is probably the greatest student of and authority on the relationship between the United States and Japan. This evening, though, we're going to talk more widely about the United States and Asia. It doesn't exclude us talking about Japan, and perhaps we will in this brief conversation. But what has been striking in recent years, Glen, has been this notion of the Obama administration that it should pivot towards Asia, that it should refocus on Asia.
Right.
Now, at the same time, occasionally, the rest of the world intrudes, as at present Ukraine, Islamic State.
Right.
So how meaningful has the effort to rebalance towards Asia been?
Well, as you mentioned, David, in the first Obama administration, there was a considerable effort on this pivot to Asia. I remember November 14th of 2009, President Obama, on his way to the APEC meeting in Singapore, stopped by Japan, gave a speech at Suntory Hall, and in that speech he said, "I am America's first Pacific president." And after that, I think it was November of 2011, that Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, had an article in Foreign Policy magazine in which she listed elements of the Asia pivot. And so I think it was from around that time in 2011 that the administration really started to be much more specific about what the pivot would include. And then also in November of 2011, the president gave a speech, a major speech at the in Canberra for the Australian Parliament. And so in the first term, with the president, with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, and also Tom Donilon, head of the National Security Council, they all focused a great deal on the importance of Asia, the importance of the U.S. shifting resources and attention to Asia. So I thought things got off to a pretty good start. And there was a kind of a flurry of activity and interest in Asia. Unfortunately, as you say, in the second term, I think part of it is that there were some personnel changes, and some of the people who came into positions in the second term weren't quite as focused on Asia as the predecessors in the first term. And these events, whether it's Egypt, Syria, Libya, Middle East peace accords, Iran, Iraq, the list goes on. There's probably about 10 different international crises. So the second term, unfortunately, the administration has not been able to focus the kind of resources and attention to Asia one might have expected, given what was said in the first term. However, I think it's still kind of an undercurrent and waiting to be picked up once the situation changes. Either some of these international crises settle down, and or when a new administration comes in.
Now, the president was back in this part of Asia
Yes.
Earlier this year.
Yes.
And the headline item on that trip seemed to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, this trade deal that a number of countries in the region are trying to reach with each other. But the visit seemed overall fairly inconclusive, not a waste of time, but there wasn't much forward motion on the TPP.
Right.
In Asia, a lot of observers are skeptical because they think it'll be very difficult to get any trade agreement past Congress, so why agree to anything?
Right.
On the other hand, American friends of mine are often quite frustrated that something they think Congress probably would buy into as good for America isn't moving ahead. How do you read that?
Well, it's a complicated issue, and the TPP was, I think, a very high priority issue for the president when he came to Asia in April. And I think there was some hope that he might be able to reach a breakthrough with Prime Minister Abe, because although there are 12 countries that are involved in the TPP, the U.S. and Japan are by far the largest of the economies of those 12 countries. And the thought was that if the United States and Japan could reach a breakthrough, if not a final agreement, that would spur the other countries also to make progress so that an agreement could be reached later this year. And then the other issue, as you alluded to, is the U.S. Congress has to pass what's called TPA, Trade Promotion Authority. Otherwise, any agreement reached could be subject to further revision and nitpicking by the Congress. And so usually what happens is that first TPA is granted by the Congress, and based on that, with the delegation of authority being granted to USTR, also the U.S. Trade Representative where I used to work, the agreement is concluded and then finally approved by the Congress. That's how it usually works. But this time, I think in part because the administration was not focused on trade in the first term, and also because it had so many other things it had to do in the second term, it didn't get around to getting TPA approval. And so without getting the approval from the Congress, the administration has been engaged in the negotiations. And the thought was that once an agreement is reached, then it could go to the Congress and get its approval. But at this point, as you point out, there wasn't the progress made on the TPP negotiations when the president came in April. But I think the trip by the president in April did have significance apart from the TPP, in part because of all these other crises taking place. And the perception by some countries that the United States, Washington in particular, wasn't quite as decisive as it should be, and some questions about, especially in Japan, about the degree of commitment by the United States to the defense of Japan in regard to the Senkaku Islands, which are in dispute between the United States and China. So I think what the Japanese government wanted most of all was for the president to say publicly, when he was in Japan, that the Senkaku Islands fall under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which had already been said by then Secretary of State Clinton, also Secretary of State Kerry, and by Secretary of Defense Hagel. But the Japanese wanted reassurance that the president would say this publicly. And the fact that he did say it publicly, and also the fact that he said publicly that the United States is supportive of Japan's right of collective self-defense, these were considered to be major advances. And so to that extent, I think the president's trip here was successful. But as you say, on the TPP front, it did not make the kind of, well, there was progress made, but not to the extent that was expected. And now that the midterm elections are coming up in the United States, there's not much hope that the Congress will act on TPA between now and November.
Yes, almost certainly.
But there is still hope among the trade aficionados in Washington that some kind of agreement will be reached among the trading partners, perhaps by the APEC meeting in November in Beijing. So the hope, I think, is that progress will be made on the TPP negotiations, and then sometime after November, the Congress will grant TPA authority.
In the recess session, perhaps.
Perhaps. But there are a lot of moving parts here, and I think part of it depends on the outcome of the election, and also the calculation about what can be possible either in the recess session or after the new Congress takes office, the seats in January of next year. And so, some optimists are hoping that something could be wrapped up by the end of this year. There are some pessimists who believe that the TPP negotiations and the TPA authority are kind of dead in the water, and we can't expect anything even in the next 2 years. And so it won't be until we have a new administration, January 20th of 2017, that we can actually get something done on TPP. So there's a wide range of opinion here. And
that's a long way off. Yes. Now, the other, that, of course, is the major international economic issue in this part of the world. But the South China Sea, of course, keeps producing mini crises between China and other stakeholders of the South China Sea, bordering on it. And this is quite worrying, I think, more widely in the region, the sense that so much seems to be unsettled all of a sudden. And many of the smaller countries seem to look to Washington, hopefully, perhaps not as a guarantor outright, but as a country that could exert a positive influence on behalf of the smaller actors down the line. How does this play in Washington?
Well, I think that China is a very looming presence in the minds of Washington, people in Washington on a number of fronts, but including South China Sea. And the continuing territorial disputes between China and Vietnam, China and Philippines, China and the United States, China and Japan, are all issues of concern, especially to the security community in Washington. So I think that that's another element of this Asia pivot or Asia rebalance that is seen as a positive step, that the United States would allocate more resources, devote more attention to Asia, in part to help to maintain peace and stability in the region so that the economic development that has been so striking in the last 30 or 40 years can continue. And so I think that just as you mentioned, even countries like Vietnam, which obviously had a war with the United States for quite some time, are hoping that the United States can be an honest broker or balance so as to limit China's expansionary tendencies. And on the United States side, I think those who are in favor of the Asia pivot or rebalance, among the things that's motivating them is the United States to take advantage of the economic opportunities presented in Asia, but also to help project American military presence to ensure peace and stability in the region.
Finally, towards the other end of Asia, towards West Asia, new government in India. Prime Minister Modi was recently in Japan, a virtual love fest, his visit. Clearly a very strong personal and long-standing relationship with Prime Minister Abe. Things have not been all sweetness and light between India and Washington in recent years, surprisingly, because perhaps the only great foreign policy achievement of the Bush administration had been a breakthrough with India between 2005 and 2008, and then it all sort of got lost in diplomatic blunders on both sides, such that by last December, the two countries were barely speaking to each other inexplicably. Is Washington even interested in India at this point?
Well, I think Washington is interested. I mean, it's an area that you know about much more than I do. But, well, my sense is that the presence of China is behind a lot of the calculation of people in Washington. And I think that perhaps not as much as those people in Japan who are looking at China as a balance, to India as a balance to China, but I do think that people in the United States certainly recognize the economic growth and development in India, the opportunities present there. I mean, American companies, IBM, Intel, Microsoft. There's just a whole bunch of American companies, especially in high tech, that have invested in India. And recognize the tremendous opportunities there in terms of trade and investment. And I think the security dimensions and the political dimensions, especially with China, with Pakistan, are all part of the big game that's going on here. And so I do think that the administration will be making more of an effort to have good ties with India. So I think we can have some optimism there.
Well, I hope so, because the U.S. has a number of very talented policy actors, not all of them in government at any given time. People like Strobe Talbot at the Brookings Institution, Nick Burns at Harvard, who have very strong relationships in India and who can help.
Right.
Likewise, there are many in Delhi who have very strong positive experience of the United States.
Right.
But somehow the relationship seemed undermanaged at the highest level in both countries, such that it really did go spectacularly off the tracks in ways I've rarely seen happen between two countries that have so many reasons to work with each other.
Right.
So perhaps we'll see out of Modi's upcoming sessions with Obama.
I actually see in Washington a lot of conferences and seminars and meetings on U.S.-India relations. So I think at least on the non-governmental level, my sense is that things are getting stronger. And hopefully at the governmental level as well.
And certainly the business community in the U.S., I think, infuriated as it may be with the red tape and all the rest of it in India, still considers India a great opportunity.
Another aspect, too, that I see being in the United States is the Indian-American community in the United States is very active in terms of business, especially in high tech on the West Coast, and the financial community on the East Coast, and also in cultural and political affairs. You know, there are two governors now in South Carolina and Louisiana who are from Indian ancestry, and there's a lot of activity among Indian Americans, and so I can't help but think that the relation between India and the United States will get stronger over time.
Well, perhaps Washington needs to dial up Tokyo and ask for some advice on how to build a very positive relationship with Mr. Modi. In any event, thanks so much for being with us, Glen, this evening for the public event just now, so that friends online interested can hear about this. It's always wonderful to see you back in Japan. I don't think there's anybody alive who has invested more in the relationship between Japan and the United States, and it's a relationship worth investing in.
Well, thank you very much,
congratulations.
David. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.